The Adventures of a Newcomer, Chapter 17, in which the darling runs away in good earnest. Recess, announced the study keeper at the word. The silence, which had been sensitive to the scratching of a pen, was broken by the shuddering of books, the slamming of desks, the shifting of chairs and of feet, and in a moment the noise, with its markers, was transferred to the yard. The study keeper cast a glance down the aisles, and, satisfied that all the students had left the room, took his departure. His footfalls were still sounding upon the pavement outside, when a head bobbed up from behind a bench, and two small eyes glanced wearily about. Satisfied that the coast was clear, the owner of the small eyes, no other than Ethelred Preston, awoke to the sudden activity. Going to a certain desk, he helped himself hurriedly to 3 or 4 fountain pens, a box of letter paper, a gold pen, a silver watch, and a few odds and ends. He then thoughtfully put on a fine, heavy overcoat, the best in the hall, which happened to be Earl Merryweather's. He took the coat without malice. He had no particular grudge against Earl, but Earl's coat was the best, and he chose it as a matter of business, satisfied that under the lamentations of time and place he had done his best. Ethelred threw open one of the windows on the side opposite the playground and leapt out. Pausing for a short time to assure himself that there was no one near, he made his way under the long shadows of the trees to the back gate of the college. As he went along, he could hear the shouts of the boys in the yard. From the shadows he could see them running about in the moonlight. The prefects were both in full view of his eyes, but at satisfactory distances. Crouching at the gate, the amiable Ethelred shook both fists at the yard and the inmates thereof, and then slipped out of the college grounds. "Now I'm safe," he grunted as he reached the first of the line of maple trees, and retiring into its shadows, mopped the perspiration from his brow. It was a chilly night, but Ethelred was not sensitive to the cold as yet. Having regained his breath, he started down the road, keeping to the side where the shadows lay thickest. The moon shone clear and full, throwing a ghastly white light upon the middle of the way. There was no wind, but a branch stirred, and the silence about him was accentuated by the shouts of lads on the playground. Ethelred could hear his own breathing, and it frightened him. He stopped once more to regain his breath. As he stood still, there suddenly came, or seemed to come, upon his ears a low groan. Was it imagination? He could hear his heart beating now, and down his back there swept an old chilly sensation. He listened again, but all was silent. "I'm scared," he said. He spoke aloud to reassure himself by the sound of his own voice. "I won't stop any more." And walking swiftly, he made toward a clump of trees some rods further down. As he advanced, he heard, or fancied he'd heard, a movement as of stealthy footsteps on the further side of trees which lined the way, but he gave no heed to these real or fancied sounds. He felt sure that it was his disturbed imagination. No one even frequented this road except the students of the college, and they were now on their way to their night prayers. At length the clump of trees and the underbrush were reached. Pushing through the weeds, Ethelred made for an old stump standing out plainly in the light, and scattering aside with his hand some dried twigs and leaves, he uncovered to the moon a large valise. As the barndish bands glistened in the light, Ethelred gave a sob of relief. "Now I'm all right." He raised the valise in his hands. It was heavy. "Your money or your life?" At the words, uttered in a low, guttural, disguised voice, the valise dropped from Ethelred's hands. His blood seemed to freeze in his veins, and there was a horrible, stinging sensation about the roots of his hair. His eyes lifted once, and then he fell back flat upon the ground. 5 weird figures had hemmed him in, 5 unearthly figures. To Ethelrod's eyes, they seemed to be giants. Black masked were on their faces. High conical hats covered their heads. Long robes reached from their shoulders to their feet. They stood like statues, each with one hand upon the hip, and the other holding a pistol pointed at the unhappy youth. No wonder he fell. "Get up as you value your life. Don't open your mouth," came the same unnatural voice. Ethelred arose and staggered as he stood. "Put up your hands." The boy obeyed, and while 4 of the strange figures continued to bear themselves like statues, the one who had spoken came forward, carried away the valise, and then examined Ethelrod's pockets. He went about it slowly. While not a figure moved, Ethelrod's hands continued high in the air. He breathed heavily and wished in his heart that one of those figures would move or cough. Anything rather than the silence and the pointed pistols. It was a long search for Ethelrod's pockets, where many of all of them were well stored. The collection made a little heap: pencils, knives, money, ties, cuff buttons, 3 watches, and all manner of little knickerchiefs. Next, the examiner took off Ethelrod's overcoat, then his vest. Stepping aside, he returned with other clothes upon his arm. These he handed to Ethelred, motioning him to put them on. With trembling fingers and breathing heavily, Ethelred made an endeavor to put on the best. Oh, if he could but open his mouth! He was suffocating. He could not even swallow. But to open his mouth, as he understood, the leader's words meant death. The vest slipped from his clasp, while fresh drops of perspiration broke out upon his face. The silent robber then took the overcoat and threw it over Ethelred's shoulders, and placed the vest and coat upon one of the nerveless arms. He slipped 2 silver dollars into his hands, which, however nervous their owner might be, instinctively closed upon them tight. "Count 20, then run for your life, and don't dare open your mouth till you have reached the station. But first, turn your face towards the village, and don't look back," came the sepulchral tones of the leader. While the figures, thus far motionless, lowered their pistols and massed themselves between Ethelred and the college, Ethelred tried to count 20. He must have broken down and began again 5 or 6 times. He certainly counted 20. When he felt quite sure that he had followed his injunction, he took to his heels, and as he started, there came behind him a loud, deafening explosion, which lent him wing speed. In the time that it took to narrate it, Ethelred had disappeared from the view of his ghostly persecutors. "Well," exclaimed the leader, throwing off his mask and revealing the merry faces of Ed Devereux, "wasn't it a grand success?" "Stunning," said George Haynes, removing his weird cap. "If he runs that way," added a third, "he'll catch the train without any trouble at all." "Oh, but boys," cried Eddie, with eyes that sparkled above their wonted sparkles, "we've done a great night's work. I know that Ethelred was going to run away in Earl Merryweather's clothes, and with a few knick-knacks borrowed here and there, but I didn't think he was going to rob right and left. I could hardly keep from saying something when I took my own fountain pen and my own gold sleeve buttons out of his pocket. And I felt like putting in an oar," broke in the 4th highwayman, "when you brought out my box of writing paper. It was a birthday gift from my aunt, and each sheet of the paper has my initials stamped on it." The boys, meanwhile, had been doffing their weird attire, and now stood revealed, 5 young gentlemen in the last stages of the Knickerbocker period of life. They were radiantly happy. The fact that Ethelred had been scared out of his wits dashed not their merriment in the least. He was a thief, and a sneak thief, they agreed. The frightening which he had received was a very light punishment. And then the romance of the thing, moonlight, playing as highwaymen, pistols, they were toy pistols, which do very well at night. It was a real adventure, something that could be talked about and laughed over till examination time, and recalled and laughed over in maturer years as one of the most interesting experiences of their college life. "Wasn't that a giant firecracker? A success, though," cried Ed. "It sounded like a cannon. The darling gave a leap into the air when it went off, and then he just flew." "Oh, but this is a picnic." "Talk about circuses," chimed in Roger enthusiastically. "But wasn't it good of Father Howard to let us out?" continued Ed. "I told him that there was some thieving going on, and that I felt sure I could stop it if he'd let me take you four and stay out here from second-hour studies and night prayers. I gave him my word of honor that we would behave all right and not go beyond this roadway, and said that we'd be back before the boys were asleep. So, boys, gather up the spoils, and we'll go in and report." Father Howard was not a little surprised when the dauntless five filed into his room and placed upon his desk one large, tightly packed valise, and any number of odds and ends. "What's all this?" he asked. "Stolen goods, mostly, Father, I think," Eddie replied. "Of course, most of the things may be Ethelrod's, but we didn't have time to find out." "Ethelrod's?" repeated Father Howard. "Yes, his mamma's darling. And where is Ethelred?" "I think he's on the train by this time, in an old overcoat, and with just about money enough to bring him home. We didn't mind taking everything of value he had because we felt pretty sure that most of it was stolen, and we know that whatever was his could be returned along with his trunk." "Well, suppose you tell me all about it." Devereux told his story with a zest, and Father Howard listened with unaffected interest and delight. "When I hear a thing like that," said the vice president at the end of the recital, "I can hardly keep from wishing I was a boy again. Now you may all go to the infirmary, and tomorrow morning take a late sleep. You have had a great deal of fun, and done a good deed, too. Tomorrow I shall try to find out who owns all these things, and send what is unclaimed to Ethelred. Good night, boys. I am very much obliged to you indeed." So the father gazed at the valise, which bore the initials of Peter Lane. "This is the end of Ethelred Preston." The prefect of the college had made the like remark on a like occasion. He was mistaken. As the sequel will show, Father Howard was mistaken too. Chapter 18. A Memorable Morning. On the following day, while the students of Henryton College were at their breakfast, Earl Merriweather was solemnly baptized in the Catholic Church. At his request, no one was present, with the exception of Eddie, the happiest of godfathers, Roger Haynes, and 4 others of his classmates. Earl's face, as the services proceeded, was aglow with holy joy, and when Father Nolan poured the regenerating water upon his head and pronounced in solemn and fervent tones these sacramental words, Earl realized the beauty of the invisible garment put upon his soul, and the sweet union between himself and the most holy Trinity. Could not restrain his tears. It was the second time since his entering college that Devereux had seen Earl weep. 5 days ago his tears had been tears of anguish, and now they were tears of supreme joy. There was a special breakfast prepared for Earl and his 5 companions on the center of the table. A beautiful lily bowed its perfect chalice, and 3 splendid roses blushed before the blushing neophyte. Around Earl's plates were grouped a prayer book, a pair of beads, Sacred Heart badge, a silver medal of the Immaculate Conception, miraculous medal, and an ivory crucifix. "They're all yours, godson," said Eddie, who wanted to dance. "The prayer book is from my godfather, the beads from Father Nolan, the crucifix from Roger, and the medal from Peter Lane. The flowers are from the other fellows here, and just sit down and pitch in." he added enthusiastically. "There are biscuits for breakfast, and all the butter a fellow can use." It was a merry breakfast. They talked of many things, but finally settled upon the departed darling, and once upon that topic, never left it. "Just think," said Eddie. "He came here last Thursday morning, not quite a week yet, and it seems as though he had been here 3 weeks." "He woke us up," said Roger. "That's so," assented Ed. "Things were getting awfully dull when he came along. We hadn't had any fun to speak of since the Christmas holidays." "I've noticed," said Earl, "that the month of January is generally the dullest month in the school year." "But this month wasn't," said Ed. "It would have been only for the darling. When he came along, I was so dead that I was thinking of applying for a burial permit. But since that time everything has been on the go." "Very much so," said Roger. "First, on the day he came, Earl got into that row with Mr. Gade." "Oh, that reminds me," broke in Ed. "Mr. Gade gave me something for you. I came near forgetting all about it." Eddie pulled out an envelope as he spoke and handed it to Earl. Earl opened it and found that it contained a picture and some verses. "Did Mr. Gade write a poem for you, Earl?" asked Father Noland. Earl, before replying, ran his eyes over the manuscript. "Yes, Father," he made answer, "and it seems to be very beautiful. Isn't it kind of him?" "More kind of him than you think, Earl. Mr. Gade, though a poet, is very chary of his verses. I wanted him to write something for me lately, and he answered by quoting a few lines from a young Englishman named William Watson, who, with Thomson, promises to take the highest place among the poets of the day. Mr. Gade had Watson's book, fresh from the publisher, upon his desk, and said as he closed it, 'Not mine the rich and showering hand that strews the facial largesses of stintless muse, a fitful presence seldom tarrying long. Capriciously she touches me to song, then leaves me to the lament her flight in vain, and wonder will she ever come again.' And then Earl, he added, 'If I have an hour to spare, I shall give it to you, my dear pupil, Earl Merriweather.' You may rest assured, then, that aside from the occasion, Mr. Gade's verses were well worthy of being treasured. Probably the older you grow, the more you will appreciate them." "I believe you, sir," said Earl, and put the envelope with its enclosure very carefully away. "Well," reassured Roger, "just think of all that has happened since Ethelred arrived. After Ethelred's trouble in the morning, we had a boxing match at noon, and then Ethelred passes a new examination under the direction of Peter Sullivan and Ed Land. Next he goes to bed in the music teacher's room and is quiet for half a day. Then he climbs down a rope. And don't forget to remember," put in Ed Devereux, "that he stole 20 feet of it, and I had to pay the damages. Go on, Roger, only please try not to tire out my godson." And then, when we think we're done with him, he bobs up serenely in the dormitory next morning, and at studies is introduced to us as a reformed runaway. "And after that," added Devereux, "he kept us on the jump for 3 days to find out what he was up to. But there's one thing I feel sorry for. It's the first time since I've been here that I was ever thrown in with a student who was a thief. It's so disgusting to live near such a fellow. Last night, when I was searching him and pulling out things that belonged to the boys I knew, I felt very much like setting the whole crowd on him to give him a pounding. I'm very glad I didn't yield. It would have been an act of revenge, and the conduct of a savage." "Ethelred has been formally expelled, I hear," said Roger. "I feel bad for his poor mother," said Earl. "The boy will break her heart yet. She's a very refined woman, and I can't understand how Ethelred could live under her care and be what he is." "By the way, Earl," said Eddie, helping himself to another biscuit, "the darling went off in your overcoat, coat and vest. Did he have my overcoat too? I lent him the other things, and am not surprised at him taking them, but I am surprised that he should take my coat. He's the first boy I ever came across who had no sense of gratitude at all, said Roger, putting down his knife and fork. Why, just think of the ways he's acted with Earl Merriweather. Earl has been doing everything to make him feel at home. He lent him clothes and gave him postage stamps, and treated him to candy a dozen times. He went with him when the other boys fought shy of him. The last thing in return for all this is that the darling makes off with his overcoat. It's downright disgusting. I didn't think there were any boys made that way. A great deal of selfishness and ingratitude in the world, said Father Noland, is to be accounted for by a passion for money. People who allow the love of money to grow upon them soon come to lose their love for everything else. Few boys have such a passion for gain as Ethelred seems to have. Well, he's done anyhow, Eddie observed, and he'll not show his face here again, added Haines. There's not a single boy in the yard who'll touch him with a 10-foot pole. Poor fellow, said Earl. We are abusing him when we ought to pity him. He was an unhappy boy when he was here, and he was unhappy when he left. I feel very sorry for him. And with this charitable comment, Earl rose, and forgetting Ethelred on the moment, put himself to prepare for the first Friday. And we will continue this story next Friday. Thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.